However, the Inca regime deserves study. This is socialism at its most successful, because remember, socialism implies the economic governance of society, and that implies a centralized government, and that implies a bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy has to rest its power on absolutes. Currently, of course, in various other societies for a time, it can get by pleading that it has expertise or some other special quality that makes it superior to ordinary human beings, but eventually a bureaucracy has got to get down to fundamentals and absolutes. And that means that it's got to have not merely an absolute monarch, but it's got to have an incarnate God. The process of evolution in Rome you all know too well for me to do more than merely mention it. But notice that with the first revolutionary who succeeds in overthrowing the Republic, Julius Caesar, he becomes Divus Iulius after his death. And Augustus is content to be regarded as merely the adopted son of a divinity during his own lifetime, and to make sure that he will be raised to heaven as soon as he dies. But as the bureaucracy expands, and it has to, because once it has started strangling the economy of a nation, it's got to go ahead and sink its tentacles, wrap its tentacles tighter, sink its mandibles deeper into the society. You eventually come out with Diocletian, who just frankly proclaims that he is Dominus et Deus. He is master and God, and that is that. This desire to see a divine or quasi-divine being at the head of so mundane and necessarily corrupt a thing as a government is a tendency that is necessary for the success of socialism. You may have noticed that in recent years the great warlords of the world, Roosevelt, Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, were all adored as somehow superhuman beings, as saviors of a kind, adored with a completely irrational fanaticism. I remember having been in Washington the day of an event that was much celebrated even in New Deal circles. The news of Roosevelt's death was withheld for hours until the liquor stores could be closed and so on. I happened to be eating dinner in a dining room in the place where I was then working with a young lady who was one of my most competent assistants. And we were eating quietly at the table. This was fairly well on in the evening. I've forgotten how late it was. But the news was already out. And there came approaching us a woman. I later discovered she belonged to another branch. She was a college graduate. Not only that, she had a master's degree and had done some work toward a doctorate. And I would say she was not by any means a co-ed. She was, well, let's say a little above 30. Tears streaming down her face and dripping over her dress. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? He has left us. Well, I told her I was going to eat dinner with a better appetite than I had had for years. Well, I found her amusing. And by the way, it's a very interesting psychological fact that I cannot explain, for she was simply livid at my reply. But she didn't try to attack me. But she almost attacked physically this lady who was with me and who had been discreet enough not to say anything in that little conversation. But it is curious, this cult of the Superman. One of the most alarming things in recent years was one of the reactions to the great communist campaign against the anti-communists that Dr. Benson mentioned in his opening address. After the orders went out on the 5th of December 1960, of course, the American comrades and their tools began to spit and puke at all American conservatives through their favorite channels, the People's World, Time, New York Times, Newsweek, The Worker, so on. And one of their principal targets was, of course, an American society that the communists fear perhaps more than any other. And their principal target was the great American patriot who's head of that society, Mr. Robert Welch. And these vermin dug up a quotation from a letter, which they'd succeeded in stealing a copy, that was critical of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, this was usual spear technique, of course. The thing that alarmed me was the success of it. The great number of American people who are willing to regard criticism of an American president as something impious, something unholy, something nefarious, something you shouldn't do. In a nation capable of governing itself, in a nation of free men, it would be understood that all men are mortal, and furthermore, that all men have mortal shortcomings. It is not corruption, it is the absence of corruption that should be astonishing. It would be understood that when you consider a president or a ditch digger or any other human being, you must consider him on his record. You must look for the evidence. The willingness to assume that there was something unholy about criticizing Pharaoh or incarnate God, our master of our destiny, the super being in the White House, was simply an indication that we have a considerable population composed of people that evidently wants and deserves a master. And that is Aristotle's definition of the born slave. Now, socialism is a centralized and omnipotent government which, of course, has control over all economic activities. The perfect form of it, though often, the true form of it, though often very inefficient, is to be found in the typical Oriental despotism. We speak of absolute monarchies in the West. Remember, the Western tradition has never permitted absolute monarchies. Louis XIV might say, l'état c'est moi, but Louis XIV did not have, even in theory, absolute power in France, such as a Turkish or a Muslim caliph, whether Turkish or otherwise, such as a Hindu Raja, such as a Chinese emperor would enjoy by definition. Our more recent demands for socialism come from the union of sentimentality on the one hand and discontent with civilization on the other, with this latent tendency to prefer a kind of society in which men can live by instinct and will not have to think for themselves. You can trace it back to the 18th century, particularly Jean-Jacques